Starting right away with arguably the biggest PS2 fan translation release of 2024, Tales of Rebirth. In December that year, less than 2 weeks after I uploaded my first PS2 fan translations video, Lifebottle Productions published their full English patch for Tales of Rebirth. This was a long-awaited patch, and now allows fans to finally play one of the few unlocalized Mothership Tales of titles in English. Tales of Rebirth's world is one where humans and beasts coexist. Their cooperation led to the founding of the Kingdom of Kalegia in ancient times. Moreover, the mysterious Force power became usable by humans, which was previously something only beasts could use. In the modern day, King Lindbloom's mysterious passing destabilizes the Kingdom of Kalegia. Protagonist Vague Lungberg, a young man from the Village of Souls, and his friend Claire Bennett are caught up in the resulting mess. This mess includes political intrigue, magical powers going out of control, discrimination, and those signature Tales skits. Gameplay-wise, Tales of Rebirth adopts an evolved version of the 2D side-scrolling battle gameplay first established in Tales of Phantasia back on the SNES. In Tales of Rebirth, player and enemy characters are on 3 different planes. Before battles, players allocate characters to one of these planes, while in battle they can switch between them. These strategies, among other things like enhancing your equipment, remain critical to success. Another interesting mechanic is the brief Claire-side portions of the story that allow you to experience parts of Rebirth's tale from Claire's perspective, a precursor to Tales of Exilia's dual route system. The reason why Bandai Namco did not localize Tales of Rebirth is most likely due to their historical reluctance to localize Tales games that's historically well known. Fortunately, the following Mothership title, Tales of Symphonia, became the most successful Tales game to date at that point. Thanks to Symphonia's phenomenal success, all future home console Tales of titles saw official localizations from that point on, alongside older titles like Rebirth receiving more attention. Maybe one day Bandai Namco will return to Tales of Rebirth, but until then, this patch is your best option. Another game likely getting a remake many years down the line is this one, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. This title is a remake of Eternal Punishment, the second half of Persona 2. The first title, Innocent Sin, takes place in Sumaru City and focuses on 7 students from Seven Sisters High School as they seek to track down and apprehend the mysterious Joker. And no, this has nothing to do with Batman. Eternal Punishment is a direct sequel to Innocent Sin, following that game's ending, where Maya Amano becomes the protagonist. As one of the earliest Persona games, this was before the days of social simulation, strict time limits, and controversial LGBTQ+ representation. In fact, many fans who've played Persona 2 believe that it's among the best Persona games ever made, and by far the most LGBT friendly. Both titles originally released for the PS1 in the late 1990s, with both becoming popular among Atlus fans back in the day. The first half of Persona 2, Innocent Sin, did not leave Japan on the PS1, but Eternal Punishment did. When these classic games were remade for the PSP in the early 2010s, in a huge twist of irony, the exact opposite happened. So why did Innocent Sin get localized but Eternal Punishment not get localized on PSP? Well, we don't exactly know. The reason that Atlus stated publicly by former PR manager Nick Maragos is unusual circumstances, which tells us absolutely nothing. However, Atlus were clearly aware fans would not like this news, therefore they re-released the original PS1 title on PSN as a quote-unquote consolation prize. The PSP remake added quality of life features, as well as an extra scenario starring Tetsuya, the protagonist of Innocent Sin, in order to bridge the 2 games together. So this isn't just a port, and fans' disappointment was justified, especially given Atlus's lack of specific explanation. Hence, fans eventually worked to localize Persona 2 Eternal Punishment themselves, and in July 2022, a patch for the game finally came out, allowing players the chance to experience both versions of Persona 2 on one platform. As of now, this is the best way to experience Persona 2, and is essential if you're a fan of the series, at least until the inevitable Persona 2 remakes, the existence of which is now publicly known thanks to Atlus leaker Midori basically confirming it online. So until these remakes are announced and come out, the fan translation of Eternal Punishment is your best way to finish the Persona 2 story. I've talked a lot about Atlus's obscure Growlands series on this channel, but not so much about the series it's a spiritual successor of, Langrisser. While this series has somewhat returned in the last several years, ranging from 2 excellent remakes to the far from excellent reincarnation Tensei, Langrisser is more well known than it's ever been. Yet, Many Careersoft titles still lack an English translation, especially older Langrisser titles. The sole exception is Langrisser IV, which you can now play in English via a fan translation which first released in July 2011. Langrisser IV is set 200 years after Langrisser II, which is officially available on modern platforms by the way. In this game, you play as siblings Ricky and Randius, who seek to rescue their sister Rachel from the evil wizard Gizloff. There are 3 possible ending paths players can pursue throughout their time in this game: Light, Chaos, and Independence. Notably, your allies and enemies differ depending on the route you choose, including Rachel. Interestingly, Langrisser V is a concurrent and direct sequel to the Independent path. While there's a lot of replay value within Langrisser IV, if you're only looking to play through the game once, the Independent path may be your best option. Langrisser IV is a turn-based strategy RPG. If you've played other retro 2D strategy RPGs like Fire Emblem, Tactics Ogre, or even other Careersoft titles, you know what you're getting into here. Much like other Langrisser titles, each unit is a platoon with a commander, and not just an individual fighter. Turns are decided based on the judgments of each commander, and not the typical ally/enemy phases. Also, the music is badass, but given Noriyuki Iwadare helped compose tracks for this game, that shouldn't really surprise anyone. What also shouldn't surprise anyone is that, much like all of Careersoft's classic titles, Langrisser IV was well received by fans of the series in Japan. So why was Langrisser IV not localised outside of Japan? There are multiple reasons we can theorise. These include the fact Sony's content approval process heavily discriminated against 2D based games, because they really wanted to push the PlayStation's 3D graphics outside of Japan. This is why Sony blocked the majority of 2D sprite based games from coming to North America, and to a lesser extent Europe. Moreover, the niche nature of strategy RPGs, combined with this game's story following on from the then unlocalised Langrisser II, also went against it. Finally, much like Langrisser III and V, Langrisser IV also debuted on the Sega Saturn at first, which obviously wasn't viable. Maybe one day Extreme, or whoever owns the Langrisser franchise nowadays, remakes the rest of the 1990s era Langrisser titles. Wouldn't that be nice? Now we're moving on to one of the most well-known Japanese exclusive Switch titles, Yokai Watch 4. This is the 4th title in the popular Yokai Watch franchise, and the first all-new title to be developed for HD platforms. Yokai Watch 4 introduced many new features to the series, including a third-person perspective, humans directly fighting, more than 2 protagonists, yokai keystones, and celestial discs. The original Switch release, subtitled We're Looking Up at the Same Sky, released in Japan on the 20th of June 2019, but that wouldn't have been the last time we'd see Yokai Watch 4. Level 5 released a paid expansion, Yokai Watch 4 Plus. This added a new area, Hell's Kitchen, nothing to do with the TV show by the way, access to fan favourite area Blossom Heights from previous games, and much more. In December 2019, Yokai Watch 4 was released in Japan for both Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 4. Now, Level 5 did confirm a localization back at Anime Expo in 2019 for Yokai Watch 4, however, this was just months before Level 5 began to retreat from the worldwide market. They closed down their American branch and laid everyone off following the localization of Snack World for Dungeon Crawl Gold. Not only did Yokai Watch 4 slip through the cracks, but literally every other Level 5 title that came out around the same time did so as well. Level 5 have rapidly corrected course since and are now fully committed to localizing their games again, with the likes of Deca Police and Fantasy Life I all confirmed for a worldwide release. As no word of Yokai Watch 4's localization in English has surfaced since Level 5's revival, it's safe to assume it's likely not happening now, especially given other Yokai Watch titles have been announced since. It's worth noting that localization companies usually focus on localizing the newest titles in development, as not going back to the older titles, because this takes away time, resources, and profitability from newer titles. Additionally, Nintendo has not stepped in to localize Yokai Watch 4 for the Switch, which is a shame as it would be a good PR move for them to do so. That said, the game did get an official Chinese localization patch into all releases. Yokai Watch 4 even got an official release in mainland China last year, which is quite weird. As for the fan translation, fans stepped in to translate the game following the official de facto cancellation. Now there's at least one way for Yokai Watch fans to play this title in English. Unless Level 5 decides to re-release the game themselves, it's unlikely Yokai Watch 4 will ever see the light of day outside of Asia. If you're desperate to check out Yokai Watch 4, I'd recommend jumping on this patch. If you ask an RPG fan when they think of the Sega Saturn, they'll probably say Sakura Wars. In October 1996, the first Sakura Wars game took Japan by storm upon its initial release. the unique blend of 1920s Tokyo with cyberpunk undertones, alongside its cheerful, optimistic storytelling style and characters, defined the Sega Saturn for many Japanese fans, and even further afield as well. You play as Ichiro Ogami, who runs the Tokyo Imperial Combat Review. He and his female allies must protect Japan from evil, while moonlighting as a theatre troupe by day. Sakura Wars soon became a franchise, as it helped define and pioneer the visual novel JRPG hybrid in its early days. Long visual novel cutscenes drive Sakura Wars' story, with strategy RPG segments peppered throughout. Similarly iconic JRPGs you might know of range from Atlus' Utawareru franchise to adult titles like Alicesoft's Rance series. So, why did Sega not localize Sakura Wars into English, despite its iconic legacy in Japan? Well, it's not for lack of trying. First of all, Sega were uncertain whether Sakura Wars would even have a market outside of Japan, which given how niche visual novels were back then, makes a lot of sense. However, Sega did publicly confirm they intended to localize all new projects in the then brand new Sakura Taisen World project when they initially announced it back in 2002. One of these projects included a full remake of Sakura Wars 1 alongside the newest entry in the series, Sakura Wars 5. Unfortunately, thanks to various circumstances, Sega's plans fell through, meaning Sakura Wars remains a niche series outside of Japan today. These range from the Sakura Wars PS2 remake selling poorly, alongside Sony of America later blocking an attempted localization of Sakura Wars 1 and 2 on the PSP because they saw Sakura Wars as a text novel. More recently, Sega's 2020 reboot of the series, confusingly released as Sakura Wars in the West, they are two different games, had a mixed reception in Japan. This is because Sega changed the RPG gameplay to action combat, and they also sent it out to die by making it PS4 exclusive, with no late ports to PC or Nintendo Switch, effectively meaning most RPG fans in Japan will never play it. In the meantime, I recommend playing the fan translation patch released by a fan translation group led by Noah Steam. Version 1 of this patch debuted in 2019, with a much more refined re-release following up in October 2021. With the patch now widely available, Sakura Wars' grand franchise debut is now playable in English. Sakura Wars remains beloved in Japan even after all this time, plus many Western JRPG fans who've played the localized and fan-patched Sakura Wars titles look back on them fondly. Therefore, I do think there's a chance Sega will eventually localize the older Sakura Wars games. I wouldn't even be surprised if Sega has official English scripts for multiple Sakura Wars titles in their archives. In the meantime, JRPG, visual novel and game history enthusiasts alike must play this game. Much like the Nintendo 3DS, Square Enix have an extensive backlog of Japan-only Nintendo DS titles that never left Japan, both new IP and remakes of classic RPGs. While I plan to cover some of these in future parts, today I want to touch on one you've likely never heard of, Cross Treasures. Developed by Sin Sophia, yes that Sin Sophia, Cross Treasures is a third-person roguelite dungeon RPG set in a fantasy world. Players are ordered to rescue Princess Sasha by the king. Princess Sasha and her demonic kidnappers were last sighted on an island within the kingdom. The king offers you ownership of the island and a boat to travel there in exchange for rescuing Princess Sasha. With this minimalist story in place, your adventure begins. Regarding gameplay, Cross Treasures is a pretty standard dungeon RPG. Floors are randomly generated, however they will remain the same on repeat visits unless players pay a fee to change the layout. There are 4 classes players can mix and match their party with, alongside a weapon customization system and simple, yet refined, action RPG combat. Interestingly, Cross Treasures is a collaboration title with Japan's popular gaming magazine V-Jump. V-Jump readers had the opportunity to submit ideas for Square Enix and Sin Sophia to consider implementing. Collaborations between game developers and manga/anime magazines happen more often than people think. Another recent example is the Mary Skelter series by Compilation and the now defunct Dengeki PlayStation. So, why didn't Square Enix localize Cross Treasures? In a nutshell, it's most likely down to Cross Treasures' collaborative nature. The first aspect of this is licensing because V-Jump was involved, but we don't know this for sure. The second reason is because Cross Treasures is designed as a cooperative experience. Although Cross Treasures is perfectly playable solo, you must play with other people to get the full experience. There are exclusive items, quests, and worlds Cross Treasures will only let players experience if they register fellow friends on their Nintendo DS. If you lack friends interested in experiencing multiplayer RPGs with you, you're out of luck, and sadly this was quite common for DS games that were quite niche. Fortunately, fans worked on translating Cross Treasures extensively over the years, with modder Fluffy Butt, yes, that was his actual username at the time of publishing the patch, he has changed it now, releasing the complete patch in April 2017. Nowadays, it's possible to experience DS multiplayer features on both emulators and the original hardware, meaning RPG fans looking to play Cross Treasures as close to the original experience as possible are in luck. Cross Treasures is one of many experimental titles Square Enix published on the Nintendo DS, which remains unlikely to return. If this piece of gaming history piques your interest, consider checking it out. Monolith Soft are among the most critically acclaimed JRPG developers in history. It's easy to forget they used to be fully owned by Bandai Namco, meaning Monolith Soft could develop games for all formats. The most well-known Monolith Soft titles outside of Nintendo are the Xenosaga titles, which you've probably played if you were into JRPGs back in the 2000s. The other big PS2 exclusive RPG from Monolith Soft is Namco Cross Capcom, a strategy RPG crossover. This title debuted on the 26th of May 2005 in Japan and was co-developed with former Bamco subsidiary Banpresto. Namco Cross Capcom tells the story of original characters Reiji Arizu and Xiaomu. This dynamic duo must investigate various interdimensional rifts opening in their world. Eventually, they join forces with various Namco and Capcom characters to fight against the evil organisation Ulma, who also allied with other Namco and Capcom characters, mainly villains. Various Namco and Capcom series represented here include Xenosaga, Tales of Destiny, Mega Man Legends, Street Fighter, Captain Commando, and Soul Calibur. In terms of other representation, legendary composer Yuzo Koshiro composed some additional original tracks for this game. If you've played the Project Crosszone games, you already know exactly what you're getting into here. Grid-based strategy RPG goodness with 2D action battle segments. This game, given it was the first to be released in this set of RPGs, is known for being very repetitive, long and grindy, which alongside its massive Japanese voice cast and script, makes an official localization difficult to justify. That didn't stop Namco Cross Capcom from developing a cult following over the years, leading to the English fan translation alongside many official sequels, most of which we actually got localized into English. These games include the previously mentioned Project Crosszone duology on the Nintendo 3DS, which by the way directly reference events from this game. However, Super Robot Taisen OG Saga Endless Frontier on the Nintendo DS was also localized. That title features Reiji Arizu and Xiaomu alongside Xenosaga characters. As a massive Monolith Soft fan, I plan to play Namco Cross Capcom someday. I have no idea when I'll be able to, as due to the repetitiveness and length, it's easily one of the biggest time commitments to date outside of Xenoblade. Terry's Wonderland 3D is the first remake of a Dragon Quest game to launch on the Nintendo 3DS, and was the first of 3 Dragon Quest Monsters titles for the platform. The original Terry's Wonderland was known as Dragon Warrior Monsters in the West, as we did get the original game back in the day on the Game Boy Color. Yep, that's how old this game is. Interestingly, this game was localized by Eidos, which given Square Enix later acquired Eidos, makes this very ironic. Dragon Quest Monsters 1, as it's also known as, was also the first Dragon Quest game in the entire series to get released in Europe. It was the very first Dragon Quest Monsters game to exist, and it came out around the time Pokemon was booming worldwide within the late stages of the Game Boy Color's life. While Dragon Quest Monsters started developing a cult following within Japan right from the start, it wouldn't catch on in the West. One notable aspect of this game are the main characters being from Dragon Quest VI Realms of Revelation. This is a game that we didn't get overseas until the end of the DS's lifecycle. Terry's Wonderland is set before the events of Dragon Quest VI, featuring siblings Terry and Millie as children. The core premise of this game's story is that Millie gets kidnapped by monsters, and that Terry must journey to the Kingdom of Great Tree to find a way to get her back. He discovers if he wins the Monster Scout tournament, he gets one wish. Of course, that's the perfect opportunity to get his sister back. You don't need to play Dragon Quest VI to understand the story of monsters, it's completely standalone. Terry's Wonderland is a monster catching game akin to Pokemon. You go out into randomly generated dungeons, recruit monsters into your team, then train them up to win battles in the Scout tournament. There were some additions to differentiate Dragon Quest monsters from Pokemon, with some of the most notable including gendered monsters and breeding. Original critic reviews from what I could find of the original were generally quite positive. Dragon Quest Warrior's positive reception was a significant achievement. It replicated the charm of Dragon Quest on a tiny handheld, much akin to the original NES games that started the series. Plus, in what I've seen online, those that played Dragon Quest Monsters back then hold fond memories of it. Of course, because times change and remakes sell, Square Enix saw fit to remake the title on the 3DS. Thus, Terry's Wonderland 3D released in Japan on the 31st of May 2012, quickly becoming the definitive way to play this game. Alongside a huge visual and audio overhaul, the remake adds a day-to-night cycle, randomised dungeon layouts, which look quite similar to Compile Heart games, online multiplayer for up to 8 players, and the ability to import monsters from Joker 2. And of course, Mii support! It also added a 3D effect as per all early 3DS games, even if said 3D effect was minimal. Terry's Wonderland 3D Legacy is interesting from both official and unofficial perspectives. From an official perspective, Square Enix ported the game to smartphones in 2018, named Terry's Wonderland SP. This version is an enhanced port, adding a new area, new monsters, a ranked multiplayer mode, and more. Yet Square Enix didn't localise either version of this game. If Square Enix was to ever localise Terry's Wonderland 3D officially, it would likely be a port of this version. Unofficially though, Terry's Wonderland 3D is notable as one of the first 3DS fan translations to be announced and later completed. Yep, dedicated fans went out of their way to localise this game instead of Square Enix, thus helping to pave the way for the 3DS fan translation scene that exists today, and is nowadays thriving, especially given the 3DS is now a legacy platform. The patch has been well received, with fan translators attempting to replicate the charms of the series and updating the terminology the same way Square Enix would do, which I applaud. In terms of the 3DS library itself, Terry's Wonderland 3D was an important milestone in establishing Dragon Quest on the handheld long term in Japan. However, the bigger impact comes from Terry's Wonderland as a game. After all, this game birthed Dragon Quest Monsters, one of the largest running Dragon Quest spin-off games to date. It is one of the few big-budget monster-catching games that's comparable to Pokemon, which is an impressive feat. Plus, as I already touched on, Terry's Wonderland 3D's English fan translation birthed the entire 3DS fan translation scene, something that, even if you have no interest in Dragon Quest, have benefited from in some way. One of Square Enix's most underappreciated franchises is Front Mission, a series of mecha strategy RPGs that started life on the SNES. Excluding remakes and the questionable Front Mission Evolved spin-off title on HD consoles, this series has 5 mainline releases to date. 3 of them are available officially in English, while Front Mission 5, the game I'm discussing now, is a 4th Front Mission game available via a fan translation patch. Released in December 2006, Scars of the War stars protagonist Walter Feng, a new immigrant to Huffman Island. Walter, alongside 2 other children, Randy and Glenn, experience the horrors of war firsthand, which forces the 3 of them apart. The 3 boys reunite 21 years later on a peacekeeping mission as the world continues its never-ending war. Front Mission 5's story is a multi-generational tale of focusing on these 3 men. Other JRPGs with similar generational mechanics include Record of Arkwest War and Tales of Grace's F. The gameplay is your usual turn-based tactical RPG fare. However, Scars of the War being the final main Front Mission title, borrows elements from all Front Mission games up to that point, but especially Front Mission 2. Players can link with their allies in battle, with unit types depicting what actions they can take. New features include friendly fire, and part skills that allow you to adapt your weapon skills. Moreover, auxiliary backpacks from Front Mission 4 return here as well. Front Mission 5's commercial and critical reception is generally very positive, with the game receiving the greatest hits label in Japan. The reason Front Mission 5 was not localised remains publicly unknown. It's a shame Square Enix didn't localise it, as this game is one of the best strategy RPGs available on the PS2, which is very telling given all its steep competition. On December 29th, 2009, 4 years exactly since the game's Japanese release, the Front Mission Translation Project team released a full English patch for Front Mission 5. Front Mission 5's PS2 patch is not only meant another Front Mission title is now finally playable in English, but also served as an early beacon for the then young PS2 fan translation scene. At this point, Front Mission 5 is unlikely to return, unless Forever Entertainment make another bad remake in the future, something that Square Enix has already allowed them to do with the first 2 Front Mission titles for some reason. If you wish to check out Front Mission 5, your best option is via this patch. Let's discuss Fire Emblem. While Fire Emblem is arguably Nintendo's biggest RPG franchise nowadays, it wasn't always the case. On the Nintendo DS, Nintendo localized Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, a full remake of the first Fire Emblem game, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, in 2008 in Europe and early 2009 elsewhere outside of Japan. While developing Shadow Dragon, developer Intelligent Systems began planning a remake of the third Fire Emblem game, Mystery of the Emblem, originally released for the SNES in 1994. Set 1 year after the events of Shadow Dragon, Marth and allies conquer the lands for their old ally Hardin, who now rules the kingdom of Altea. However, things don't quite go to plan. Marth and co eventually rebel, because Hardin is now corrupted by the will of Garneth, the antagonist of Shadow Dragon. Gameplay wise, this is your typical Fire Emblem strategy RPG. If you've played any other 2D Fire Emblem title, you know exactly what you're getting into here. What people may not know, however, are that some of the new features typically associated with Fire Emblem Awakening actually debuted in Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem. New Mystery of the Emblem is the first Fire Emblem game to implement the casual mode as well as avatar customization, both of which are typically associated with Awakening. This avatar forms part of a new subplot, where players form one member of a mercenary gang originally tasked with assassinating Marth and co. However, they can either die or become Marth's ally. It is this legacy, alongside an overall great experience, that makes New Mystery of the Emblem worth experiencing. So why didn't Nintendo localize New Mystery? The most likely reason relates to the state of the Fire Emblem franchise at the time, especially outside of Japan. Sales were declining despite critical acclaim, and the franchise's future remained up in the air. Intelligent Systems originally planned Fire Emblem Awakening as a last game in the franchise because of this. The lower sales figures, alongside the game coming out in Japan in July 2010, so another really late DS game, made a localization unviable. Fans worked quickly to localize New Mystery into English themselves, with fan translation group The Heroes of Shadow first releasing a translation in December 2012. Further patches include a QA/typo patch in 2017 and an optional mod patch afterwards that restores New Mystery content to the original SNES game, aimed at the more hardcore Fire Emblem fan. Given Nintendo has still not released the Fire Emblem IV remake at the time of this video's production, it's unlikely they'll return to New Mystery anytime soon. Maybe in the future though. Therefore, if you're a Fire Emblem fan and enjoyed Shadow Dragon, or a video game enthusiast who wants to experience Nintendo's first iteration of a more accessible Fire Emblem, you owe it to yourself to play through this forgotten sequel. Remember that 7th Dragon game localized for the Nintendo 3DS many years ago? Well, that game was a direct sequel to these two titles I'm discussing at the start of this video, 7th Dragon 2020 and 7th Dragon 2022. Set in Tokyo within the year 2020 in an alternate dimension, quite poetic considering the events of that year IRL, this game has you play as members of Murakumo, dragon hunters who are required to slay every single dragon in order to liberate the city. This title is a hybrid between traditional RPGs and dungeon RPGs. You can create your own cast of party members, akin to wizardry, who all have both portraits and 3D models. They participate in turn-based battles with badass music composed by Yuzo Koshiro, as well as exploring the labyrinths in fully rendered 3D. The gameplay was praised, unsurprising given the pedigree of the developer Imaki Pok, and further cemented 7th Dragon as a cult classic franchise back in the day. 7th Dragon 2022 is also a direct sequel to 2020, which is unique for the series. So, why were these titles not localized? The main reason, which will be recurring throughout this video, is that by the time these games came out, the PSP was almost dead outside of Japan. Additionally, the licensing issues caused by having Hatsune Miku appear in the games, alongside the lack of localization for the previous 7th Dragon title for the Nintendo DS, meant it likely wasn't commercially viable to localize these titles. Hence, fans therefore had to step in order to translate these two titles into English. These titles were translated by a group called Cavespeak into both English and, surprisingly, Russian. These patches have been widely available for many years now, and therefore are popular titles among fan translation enthusiasts. Given that Sega is unlikely to return to this franchise given this series is officially finished, alongside all of their other current in-development reboot projects, these fan patches are your best option. Square Enix's series of remakes continues on the Nintendo 3DS with another classic title in the Monsters series, Dragon Quest Monsters 2. Dragon Quest Monsters 2 is one of the very few RPGs to feature dual protagonists, in this case siblings Kobe and Tara, known in Japan as Iru and Luca. Unlike a lot of Dragon Quest spin-offs, they are original characters. They moved to the island of Great Lock with their parents, who are monster mashers, who are a class you might be familiar with if you've played other Dragon Quest titles. Plot of this game is as follows. When their mother sends the siblings on a simple errand, various events follow, putting the entire island of Great Log at risk. Thanks to a confrontation between the siblings and known troublemakers Prince Kameha and Scruffy, they accidentally knock the plug out. This plug enables Great Log to even stay afloat, hence the whole island is now in danger. After Scruffy fills the plug hole himself, the siblings are tasked with finding a way to plug the gap to free both Scruffy and the island of Great Log, and of course, you get a slime as your first monster companion. The biggest evolution in Dragon Quest Monsters 2 is changing the randomly generated dungeons from Terry's Wonderland into uniquely designed maps, all with their own characters, stories and monsters to scout. Not to mention the unique terrain you need to navigate, such as rolling waves and fluffy clouds. Dragon Quest Monsters 2 was a successful release in Japan when it came out for the Game Boy Color on 9th of March 2001. Enix released them in two versions subtitled Kobe's Journey and Tara's Adventure respectively. For consistency's sake, I will continue referring to the protagonists under their English names, Kobe and Tara. Yep, the Pokemon influence rubbed off here given that there are differences in monster frequencies and aesthetics akin to the Pokemon games as well. Enix localised the Game Boy Color originals in North America themselves on the 15th of September 2001, while Europeans didn't get the game at all. Additionally, both Dragon Quest Monsters 1 and 2 would be remade for the original PlayStation in Japan the next year, which also didn't get released in the West. Rumours of a Dragon Quest Monsters 2 remake for the 3DS first circulated in April 2013, following on from a trademark filed by Square Enix. Before it was formally announced, Dragon Quest Monsters 2 Kobe and Tara's Marvelous Mysterious Key was later released in Japan for the 3DS on the 6th of February 2014. This version combined the original Game Boy Color releases into one title in a fully 3D environment, just like the Terry's Wonderland 3D remake. Many new features were added to this 3DS remake, making it the definitive version of the game. There are over 800 monsters to recruit, which is way more than the previous game, including monsters from the then brand new Dragon Quest X. You can also choose whether to be Kobe or Tara right from the start and utilise the new whistle and dance ability skills. You can also use the Montna monster customization feature, allowing you to make your own monster using customizable head, body, arm and back parts. Additionally, you can transfer monsters and data between this game and Terry's Wonderland 3D upon clearing both games. There are many more features, however those are some of the highlights. Much like Terry's Wonderland 3D, this remake also got an enhanced port in Japan for smartphones on the 6th of August 2020. Features added include Monster Battle, online multiplayer, and monsters from Dragon Quest XI, making this the most monster-heavy Dragon Quest Monsters game at over 900 monsters. This is the definitive version of the game content-wise, and if Square Enix was to ever localise Dragon Quest Monsters 2, a console port of this version is what is most likely. Yep, Square Enix did not officially localise Dragon Quest Monsters 2. Upon the Japanese release of this game, fans following Japanese gaming news abroad increasingly concluded Square Enix is actively choosing not to localise Dragon Quest games on the Nintendo 3DS. This led to fan outcry online, even as Square Enix later officially ended the second mini Dragon Quest gaming drought with Dragon Quest Heroes on the PlayStation 4. That said, the lack of a localization encouraged fans in the GBA temp community to translate the Dragon Quest Monsters 2 remake themselves. The patch itself has a lengthy history. Two different teams attempted to translate the game but kept running into a major tricky technical limitation. This limitation stopped a full-blown English release. To quote one of the mod's authors, the fan translators were, quote, completely stuck with a limitation built into the game by its original developers. The team could not show more than 50 or so characters on screen during any dialogue sequence. While this might have been fine for the Japanese language, this would not work for a full-blown detailed English script. Text limitations like this were quite common with Japanese RPGs, especially older titles from the 1990s, but they are infrequent nowadays. However, they do persist in some form in newer games like the 3DS remake of Dragon Quest Monsters 2. They weren't insurmountable though, as a third person managed to find a solution and solve this technical issue. On the 1st of April 2021, the first version of the full English translation patch for Dragon Quest Monsters 2 Kobe and Tara's Marvelous Mysterious Key came out. 1.1 version of the English translation followed later that August, with a French translation coming much later. And they're not done yet! They're also working on Spanish, German and Italian localization. This would bring what Square Enix would do if they ever localized Dragon Quest Monsters 2 themselves officially. I personally haven't played Dragon Quest Monsters 2 yet, however, from what it sounds like from doing my research for this video, I'm prioritizing it. Simply put, Dragon Quest Monsters 2 is an achievement in so many ways, from its original Game Boy Color incarnation right the way through to Square's additions in the remake. The game itself innovated the winning Dragon Quest Monsters formula. Additionally, the lack of an official release paved the way for fans to step in and, with years of persistence and collaboration, localise it at last. One of the most well-known victims of the Sega Saturn's poor commercial performance outside of Japan is Shining Force 3. Developed by Camelot Software Planning, Shining Force is the original incarnation of the Shining series, turn-based strategy RPGs. Alongside Fire Emblem and Langrisser, Shining Force was among the earliest and most influential strategy RPGs in the 1990s. The first two Shining Force games originally released on the Sega Genesis, becoming instant hits. With Shining Force 3, Sega and Camelot developed what was the most ambitious title in the franchise. Shining Force 3 was split into 3 scenarios over 3 separate discs, kinda like what Fire Emblem Fates is to the Fire Emblem series. Each scenario adopts a different perspective to tell one overarching story. Scenario 1 stars Symbios, a lord from the Republic of Aspinia. Scenario 2 stars Medion, a prince from the Kingdom of Destonia, the former occupier of Aspinia. Scenario 3 stars Julian, a mercenary who is the de facto true main character of Shining Force 3. Gameplay wise, Shining Force 3 is actually pretty basic for a strategy RPG. It's grid based, there are classes, levels and objectives, and there's also a character bonding system. If you've played strategy RPGs, you can get to grips with Shining Force 3 pretty quickly. There's also an exploration mode outside of battles akin to traditional RPGs of the time, such as Final Fantasy. Sega published Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 in Japan in December 1997, before following up with Scenarios 2 and 3 in April and September 1998 respectively. All 3 parts were well received in Japan, acting as a perfect send-off for the core Shining SRPG trilogy. Moreover, fans who bought all 3 scenarios and sent proof to Camelot would receive a special premium disc as a gift from the developer. This premium disc is a precursor to the kinds of bonuses companies include in limited editions today as standard, minus for DLC and early access of course. The Shining Force 3 premium disc contains 3D character and enemy models, artwork, videos, sound tests and a bonus battle mode. Only Japanese players could obtain a premium disc. Due to the Saturn's demise, Shining Force 3 sold poorly across all regions. Sega only localised Scenario 1 for a Western release in 1998, partially rewriting the game to resolve its cliffhanger ending. Rumours persist that Sega intended to localise all 3 parts, but couldn't due to the Saturn sales. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true though. What is true is Sega America's former VP of Corporate and Marketing Communications, Charles Belfield, claiming that Sega planned to port some of their games to the PS1 upon exiting the console market, directly naming Shining Force 3 as a title that would do well on there. However, as we all know, these ports never happened. What did happen though is one of the most ambitious fan translation projects to ever grace a Sega title. Over many years, fans worked to translate all of Shining Force 3's releases into English, and I do mean all of them. The first Shining Force 3 translation was originally done by the Aspinia team many years ago. This initial translation is only for Scenario 2 and 3 scripts. The game itself wasn't playable. That was until early 2005, when modder Night of Dragon spearheaded efforts to develop a program that would enable a full translation project of Shining Force 3 to begin, and it all started from there. Shining Force 3's English patch worked not only to correct Scenario 1's script, but also fully translate Scenarios 2 and 3 into English, thus completing the story, not to mention translating the scenario disc for the first time. Shining Force 3's English patch is a truly global effort by fans. There's a lengthy credits page available on the project's website, which I'll have some screens of on the screen now. This patch remains an ongoing project because the team seeks to provide the best Shining Force 3 experience possible even after 10 plus years. The most recent version of Shining Force 3's patch, version 25.1, released in October 2024, this patch fixed numerous bugs, typos and many other issues. That's how dedicated fans are to ensure Shining Force 3 continues to be enjoyed by new audiences even to this day, and it's a fantastic legacy for one of Sega's most beloved RPG franchises. As for an official release, this seems unlikely, for now at least. Sega have never re-released Shining Force 3 in any form. The Shining series itself went on an extended hiatus after Shining Force 3, and only once Sega stopped making hardware did they begin to revive the series, albeit deviating it away from strategy RPGs with mixed results. However, Sega's desire to return to older franchises means I believe they will eventually return to Shining in some form. As for Camelot, their fate is widely known at this point, so it's unlikely they'd personally return to Shining Force. If playing Shining Force 3 interests you, I recommend playing this patch. The final game I'm discussing in this video is one of the absolute worst RPGs ever made, Ancient Roman: Power of Dark Side, which has nothing to do with ancient Romans. Developed and published by Nihon Systems in Japan in April 1998, Ancient Roman tells the story of Kai Orpheus, a young man kidnapped as a child and subsequently forced into child labour. Once he finally sees freedom from the mines at 17, he teams up with his friends Michaela Almea and Burke Schwartz to stop a deadly virus turning everyone in the world into monsters. So on the surface, this game has a promising story. Does it deliver? Well, you already know the answer. Gonna get right to the point, this game is so shit, it's unironically amazing. Ancient Roman is notorious for its terrible graphics, bafflingly strange soundtrack, and most of Ancient Roman's backstory, which as I mentioned earlier has nothing to do with Romans or even Italy, isn't even available in the main game. Instead, it's exclusive to a separate drama CD, making that drama CD essential listening for those seeking more of Ancient Roman's terrible storytelling. Ancient Roman was not localized because this game is shit. Even though this game is 3D, so it does meet that angle. Sony's PlayStation 1 era content policies, Ancient Roman does not exactly showcase the PlayStation in its best light. So it's highly likely that Sony would not have approved this game. And also, Ancient Roman would damage the PlayStation brand had it come out in English. Oh, for fuck's sakes. Yet, despite this, Ancient Roman became one of the most iconic kusogi, aka shit games, ever made. It's even been unironically referred to as the Final Fantasy killer. This god tier, meme tier status led fans to mock the game online for many years, even without an English translation. In July 2024, fans released a full patch for Ancient Roman, meaning you can now play this game in English from start to finish. Ancient Roman is an interesting case study of how even bad games deserve to be preserved, and when required, fan translated. Because you see, they are just as important in gaming history as other classic PlayStation 1 titles like Tales of Phantasia and Shin Megami Tensei. Time to make a trip back to the land of controversy for this game. Wait, a Shiren game is controversial? We'll get to that. Shiren the Wanderer 4, The Eye of God and the Devil's Navel is the fourth mainline title in the Shiren series, which itself a part of the wider Mystery Dungeon franchise. The game originally came out for the DS in 2010, before receiving an enhanced PSP port in 2012. The gameplay is as you'd expect for a Mystery Dungeon title, although given this was the fourth game, it does lack the refinements found in the newest entries. So why wasn't this game localised? That became obvious in early 2024, once fans released a full patch for the game online, and this is also the reason why I've not gone over the game's story. Within the first hour, you find the inhabitants of the island Shiren and Copper are shipwrecked on are stereotypical, racist depictions of native and indigenous tribes. One way this is obvious is because they threaten to burn Shiren and Copper at the stake, as well as various stereotypical depictions throughout the prologue. This is quite shocking considering how recent the game is, alongside the pedigree of the writer Masato Kato, who has worked on the likes of Final Fantasy XI and Chrono Trigger. I'm confident in stating that any company who considered this game for localization back in the day had to pass on this title the moment they discovered this content exists. Not localizing controversial content is the job of localization companies, especially back before Japanese developers made their games with a worldwide release in mind and preemptively chose not to follow this kind of path. Additionally, the late release of the PSP port likely also contributed to this game's fate, as even without the controversies, it's unlikely this game would have been profitable. Could this game come back one day? Following the success of the newest Shiren the Wanderer game, it is possible. However, Spike Chunsoft will have no choice but to amend the racism within the game's story. It's a huge shame this whole situation is even a thing, because the quality of the game is overall good otherwise. However, in this case, not localizing Shiren the Wanderer 4 is the correct decision. One of the more well-known JRPG fan translations of recent years is the 2022 release of Noora Totoki no Kobo, Kiri no Mori no Majo, aka Noora and the Time Studio, The Witch of the Misty Forest. Developed and published by Atlus in July 2011, this title was a collaboration with Shinichi Yoshike, the creator of the Atelier series. Etchonessy and Heart of Crown illustrator Yuji Himikai provided the art direction and illustrations. Given how well known Noora and the Time Studio is thanks to this patch, many YouTubers have already covered the game extensively, therefore I'm going to stick to a summary for the purpose of this video. You play as Noora Bandor, a young girl possessing the power to distort time. After being mistaken for a witch, Noora must build trust with the villagers in order to clear her name. In the process, she must hide her time-bending powers. Meanwhile, Viera, an actual witch, lives in the nearby Misty Forest. In Noora and a Time Studio, you complete tasks for the villagers and traverse through 2D maps to collect materials to work on at your atelier. Whether you gather herbs or fight monsters, if you've played any Atelier game, you know what you're getting into here. This title differs greatly from your typical Atlus game. The low stakes, cozy nature of Noora vastly contrasts with Shin Megami Tensei and similar titles. Moreover, this game is unusually short for an Atlus game. You can clear Noora and a Time Studio in around 8 to 12 hours, with more perks available on repeat playthroughs. As Noora and a Time Studio is refreshing for Atlus, surely Atlus USA would localise this game, right? Well, no. While there is no publicly known explanation, I have a theory. Atlus released this game very late in the DS's life. Therefore, Atlus USA could not localise all of their DS titles before moving over to the brand new Nintendo 3DS. Additionally, Devil Survivor 2's DS version would come out in Japan exactly 7 days later. Finally, relaxing RPGs like Atelier were much more niche in the early 2010s than they are nowadays. Therefore, Atlus made the sensible business decision to localise Devil Survivor 2 instead. With hindsight, given how Devil Survivor 2 and 2010's Radiant Historia now have 3DS remakes, you could argue Atlus should have localised Noora instead, but that's in the past. Now Atlus have finally learned what direct ports and remasters are, maybe we'll see Noora and a Time Studio return in the future. In the meantime, this game may be worth checking out if you're a fan of cozy RPGs like Atelier. Designed to be a collaboration between Sting's Dokapon series and Atlus' flagship Utawaremono franchise, this board game RPG blends the world of Utawaremono with the gameplay of Sting's popular Dokapon. It was the first all-new Dokapon game since Dokapon Journey way back on the Nintendo DS. Characters from Utawaremono, Prelude to the Fallen, Mask of Deception, Mask of Truth all come together in this one world, which includes lots of funny skits between the cast who have been redesigned in chibi form. Outside the multiplayer, the online multiplayer was also a big deal as it was a first for the Dokapon franchise. Not for Utawaremono though, that honour went to Utawaremono Zan on the PlayStation 4. Even though this title has a middling reception, it's still noteworthy. It was the first Atlus game released on a Nintendo platform ever, their only physical release on a Nintendo platform, and most critically, being the first fully complete original fan-translated game for the Nintendo Switch. It all played a key role in building the Nintendo Switch fan translation scene, as the Dokapon community stepped up to translate this game fully by mid-2021, which is under 6 months of the original Japanese release on the 10th of December 2020. Localization prospects were very much up in the air, and it seems fan translators were right on the money because Atlus would not localize the title. At this point, this game will likely never get localized due to a lack of interest from the companies involved. Atlus stopped licensing out console games in 2020 and wouldn't do so again until Monochrome Mobius in 2023. The reason behind this decision is not publicly known and is part of a wider trend outside the scope of this video that I've talked about elsewhere. As for Sting, they seemingly chose to skip this title in favour of the newer Dokapon Kingdom Connect, published by Idea Factory and Compile Heart in 2023. Therefore, it's safe to assume this title will never see the light of day in an official capacity outside of Japan. If you're a fan of JRPGs, you've likely heard of Orishika Tainted Bloodlines, a PS Vita exclusive game developed in 2013 by Alpha System. Orishika is a sequel to another game, Ora no Shigabane wo Koete Yuke, which was remade for the PSP. Both these titles are developed by Alpha System, a long-running developer also known for their weird and quirky games, not just Orishika. Shoji Masuda, who created Orishika as well as another cult classic, Hero Must Die, also created this next game, Linda Cube. Linda Cube originally debuted on the PC Engine in 1995, before getting an enhanced PS1 port in 1997 called Linda Cube Again, and on the Sega Saturn under the name Linda Cube, Kanzenban. In Linda Cube, you play as Ken Challenger. What a great name, by the way. Ken and his girlfriend Linda must catch 30, 50 and 100 animals of both genders depending on the scenario. Ken and Linda must gather all these animals onto an ark sent by God to preserve life on a planet set to be destroyed by a meteor strike in 8 years. This scenario at first glance is basically the Noah's Ark of video games. And yes, this game does enforce the gender binary, which although not scientifically accurate, this game is set on another planet called Neo Kenya, so I guess that kinda makes sense as a justification. As for the gameplay, aside from catching animals, Linda Cube's gameplay is closer to traditional retro RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, with features including traditional towns, battles, and story sequences. However, Linda Cube's weirdness ends at its initial premise. This game dives into some really heavy things, including violence against animals, dogfighting, and body horror. It's a game that requires multiple playthroughs to fully understand. It's a game that, by translating it into English, you demystify the myths that Linda Cube is a weird game. This game is a horror JRPG, a very rare crossover most typically associated with Parasite Eve and Shadow Hearts. As it is, the PC Engine original is even gorier than the PlayStation 1 port. Those aren't even my words. Those are the words of Linda Cubed Again's fan translators, who released the full English patch in early 2024. This game was a 10-year passion project between translators Cardogin and hacker Espinite. They talk about their time at length translating this game in a fantastic interview with Wes Fenton in February 2024. I recommend reading the whole thing, but here's the relevant part. I think that the translation does remove a lot of the mysticism of the game, because a lot of the mysticism is specifically about stuff that the game is not about. People think that the game is very funny and very wacky, and it's kind of not. It has a penchant for slapstick, but it really doesn't venture into the crazy, insane game that people say it is. If you read my content warnings, it's more reason to not play the game than it is reasons to play the game, right? That's a thing you can say as a fan of the game when you're not doing this for money. Admittedly, when I originally added Linda Cube on the list for this video, I didn't know too much about it, but after reading this quote, I felt obliged to include it here. By keeping it in a video about PlayStation 1 games with unusual and unique circumstances, I hope I can play a small role in demystifying this game, alongside the many other patches I cover. Another thing worth demystifying is the likelihood of an official release. As of 2025, Linda Cube is co-owned between Alpha Systems' parent company Meteorize, Mars, not the chocolate company by the way, and Katakawa Corporation. Given two of these companies still operate in gaming, we may see Linda Cube come back in the future, but don't bet on it happening. If you wish to experience one of the most unique Japanese role-playing games ever made, consider checking out this patch. Going back to the land of controversy, it's time to touch on one of the most controversial games of the 2010s, Omega Labyrinth Z. Look, it wouldn't be a Vita video without a boob game, and as I'd likely get replies mentioning it, and because this story is genuinely wild on its own merits, here is Omega Labyrinth Z. This is a roguelike RPG developed by Matrix Software and published by D3 Publisher for the Vita and PS4. Gameplay is similar to the Shiren the Wanderer Mystery Dungeon gameplay style, but with lots of moe anime girls. Then of course there's all the fan service, which does include touchscreen mechanics involving big breasts, which I'm not detailing here. This game was originally announced for a worldwide release by British publisher P-Cube Games in 2018. However, Sony blocked the release at the last moment possible. This follows Australian, German and the United Kingdom banning the game, which by extension also led to the game's releases in Ireland and New Zealand being cancelled as well. Even the BBC covered this situation, and when the right-wing Tory-run and controlled BBC is covering your game, you've definitely messed up somewhere. Also, Sony's increased disdain for anything that's not a big budget Western AAA blockbuster was showing around this time, with particular, albeit understandable, disdain for ecchi. Subsequently, Sony forced P-Cube to cancel the official release, which costed them and D3 Publisher a lot of money. With an official release now impossible, fans had to step in to enable an English release. They retranslated the title for Vita and PS4, they understandably couldn't use the official translation. They released a patch allowing you to play the game in English. Due to the controversies and the financial drain Omega Labyrinth Z was, D3 will likely never touch this game again. Therefore, if you really want to play Omega Labyrinth Z, this fan translation is the best you'll ever get. Plus, D3 Publisher did move on to Omega Labyrinth Life, which did get a worldwide release with no issue. Which is quite strange as the games are quite similar, but I digress. We're coming to the end of the Dragon Quest spin-off games on the 3DS, so what better way to end the run of Dragon Quest spin-offs than the finale of the popular Joker sub-series, part of the Dragon Quest Monsters franchise. The first 2 Joker games were released back during the days of the Nintendo DS. Unlike the previous Dragon Quest Monsters games, they were the first 3D titles in the series and innovated that sub-series a lot for the time. They were quite impressive. In fact, many of these innovations would be carried over into the Monsters remakes, such as removing random battles. Both Joker games were released in North America and Europe. If you collect RPGs for the Nintendo DS or otherwise played Pokemon and Pokemon-like games, you've probably played them, especially Joker 2, which until recently was quite affordable physically, given how Nintendo published it in Europe following the success of Dragon Quest IX overseas. Additionally, Japan got a second enhanced edition of Joker 2 titled Joker 2 Professional that adds new monsters and abilities not found in the base version of Joker 2. Then after that, Joker sub-series went dormant. Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 3 was announced in the Weekly Jump in May 2015. Square announced further details in due course, including multiple new features. They include break monsters, aka more evil variants of monsters, strategy commands, the ability to customize monsters and your hero, street pass, and local multiplayer. And of course, mounts for the protagonist to ride. That said, like Dragon Quest VIII, 3D was not available in this release. Joker 3's setting is also unique, with its main location being somewhere called the Break World, featuring futuristic cities. That's something rarely featured at all in Dragon Quest, alongside the usual environments. That said, the story isn't as original, like in a lot of these plot-light JRPGs, given the protagonist is an amnesiac trying to recover his memories while finding out where those dark break monsters I mentioned earlier originated. Joker 3 was released in Japan on the 24th of March 2016 to a fairly positive reception. However, that initial positive reception was slightly soured when just 7 months later, Square Enix announced Joker 3 Professional, which is effectively what the original Joker 3 should have been. You see, Joker 3 Professional added so much new content, the original Joker 3 became obsolete within a year of its release. The biggest addition was characters from the first 2 Joker games, including both protagonists. However, other additions include 200 new monsters, bringing a total up to 700 from 500, drone exploration, rideable large monsters with their own special attacks, new partner not Shiren, designed to help skip story content for players of the original, among other things, and most notably the world of Incarnus. This is a new area with a new story content featuring the Incarnus, divine monsters said to have lineage from the gods. In other words, they're absolutely massive, and with these mysterious themes of gods and a new world, comes further changes to the gameplay, and the returning cast from Joker 1 and 2. Well, why so much content? Well, to quote Square Enix, Joker 3 Professional is the grand finale of the Joker sub-series. They went all out with it. Of course, they're still making Monsters games, but they were done with the Joker sub-series. Looking at it critically, it's effectively a paid DLC that Square Enix chose not to add to the original Joker 3, but rather re-release it as a whole new product, knowing Dragon Quest fans would buy it. In a way, this DLC was a relief for Western fans hoping for a localization. If Square Enix was to ever localize Joker 3, it would be this version of the game. Of course, at this point, Dragon Quest 7 and 8 were confirmed for the West, so fans were optimistic Square Enix might release some of the Dragon Quest spin-offs on 3DS while they still could. As expected, and as I touched on a bit with the end of the Dragon Quest 8 portion, this release didn't happen. Firstly, Square Enix, to their credit, told fans who asked on social media in 2017 that they weren't planning a localization. The source I found for this during my research was a post shared by the Dragon's Den Facebook page, where they told this person, Sean, that I'm afraid we have no plans to localize Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 3 at the moment. Sorry. This is the standard PR response when asking game publishers directly about localizing games that they've not formally announced, as giving an honest answer would put their job at risk. However, Square Enix's transparency on this matter was refreshing, especially given that they haven't acknowledged other games directly like this, and this was a few months after Joker 3's release. It's likely Square Enix already decided not to localize Joker 3 or its then unannounced professional expansion. And to anyone doubting the legitimacy of this, for what it's worth, I remember the official Dragon Quest page making similar replies to other people asking similar questions on their page, back while Facebook had the wall feature for company pages, hence why I believe this is true. On the more positive side though, both versions of Joker 3 have full fan translations. The original Joker Free fan translation came out promptly after its Japanese release, with many of the translators of this project also working on Dragon Quest Monsters 2 I mentioned earlier. However, Joker Free Professional's fan translation was up in the air for years afterwards. It was apparently leaked from the original translation group. The details on this are kind of unclear. However, that doesn't take away the fact the definitive version of Dragon Quest Monsters Joker Free is playable in English on hacked 3DSs and on emulators. Joker Free's legacy is overall quite positive. It's considered to be among the best in the series among those who've played it, and a great send-off to the Joker sub-series. Additionally, with Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince, known as Dragon Quest Monsters 3, coming west, there is plenty of life left in this sub-series yet. Even though Joker Free wasn't localised, it's safe to say audiences for The Dark Prince, as well as the experimental spin-off Treasures, which was the Monsters game, will be impacted by what the developers learned and added during Joker Free's time, even if they never played it. Additionally, as the final Dragon Quest spin-off title to be released for a dedicated gaming handheld, Joker Free holds a unique label no other game will beat anytime soon. In April 2009, Atlus USA localised an obscure Nintendo DS title called Super Robot Taisen OG Saga: Endless Frontier. This was Atlus's third Super Robot Taisen localisation, but remains their first, and only, Monolith Soft title. Endless Frontier is set in the world of the same name, with the game's story revolving around Haken and Kaguya discovering the mysteries of this world. The characters consist of an original cast, a staple of the original generation sub-series, alongside returning characters from both Namco Cross Capcom and Xenosaga. Moreover, the gameplay adopts a more traditional turn-based RPG style, with exploration, turn-based encounters and bosses much more akin to Final Fantasy and similar titles than Super Robot Wars strategy RPGs. Fans who played Endless Frontier back in the day look back at it fondly, and nowadays remains one of Atlus's most expensive Nintendo DS games. Endless Frontier Exceed, the game I'm discussing here, is a direct sequel to Endless Frontier. Released in Japan in February 2010, Exceed tells the story of Aledi and Naech, two new characters in the original generation's sub-series. Aledi must escort Naech, the princess of Elf Tale, back home, while investigating new happenings within the Endless Frontier. Exceed builds on the world and gameplay introduced in Endless Frontier, capping the second half of this duology. Some fans who've played both Endless Frontier titles consider Exceed to be superior. So why was Endless Frontier not localised? The most likely reason relates to Atlus USA's brief shift in priorities in 2010 and 2011. This is when they briefly moved away from niche Japanese titles in favour of Western developed games. Other titles such as Growlands on the PSP likely met a similar fate. Moreover, Exceed was quite a late DS release in general, which likely also went against localisation. In 2019, following many years of work, Artima Translations released a full English patch for Endless Frontier Exceed, meaning fans can now finally experience the second half of this duology in English. As Monolith Soft have become more well known outside of Japan, there's never been a better time to check out their legacy catalogue, Endless Frontier included. The final game I'm discussing today is one of the most well-known Japanese exclusive PSP games, Valkyria Chronicles 3. This is the third mainline entry in Sega's wartime strategy RPG franchise, and depending on who you ask, is also the best one. Valkyria Chronicles 3 takes place concurrently with the events of the first Valkyria Chronicles. In this title, you play as members of the Galleon Army Squad 422, a division that carries out missions that no other department will. As well as being a return to form for the franchise after the more divisive Valkyria Chronicles 2, this title was one of the first JRPGs to fully utilise DLC, with all new maps and missions released as downloadable content. So why did this game not come to the West? Simply put, Valkyria Chronicles 2 did not sell enough to justify the cost of localising Valkyria Chronicles 3. Sega's then manager of console sales, Hiroshi Seno, confirmed this directly himself in a 2012 interview while in Singapore. Which, fair play to him and Sega for explicitly deconfirming this game for the West. I really wish more companies would do this rather than say nothing and leave Western audiences with false hope as a result of the silence. Another positive is that this official deconfirmation indirectly gave fans the green light to localise the game themselves. In 2014, fans released a full English patch for the Extra Edition version of the game, bringing it to the worldwide market. It's considered to be among the best games across the entire franchise even to this day. While Sega should have localised this game for the fans, their decision does make sense from a financial perspective. Given that Valkyria Chronicles was a declining franchise at the time alongside it being trapped on the PSP, I'm not surprised they chose to pass on localising this third title. However, in recent years, Valkyria Chronicles has somewhat been on a redemption, with the all-new Valkyria Chronicles 4, a remaster of Valkyria Chronicles 1, and the more divisive Valkyria Revolution all coming out in English for multiple platforms. So maybe in the future Sega might return to this game too. It's more likely than 7th Dragon at least.